referring to was the Chicago Tribune Charities presentation of Ruth Page's Nutcracker, which was the jewel of the city, and at the time was making modest efforts to diversify the casting. 6 years later, while dancing with the Dance Theatre of Harlem, I observed I was in a company surrounded by transgressive women performing a Black identity of ballet and breaking traditions. The Black female dancer's presence alone was outside of socially imposed boundaries that were placed on Black women in white ballet. We were Black women from around the world pushing against normative values of what white ornamental beauty upholds as valid. Watching Black women perform DTH's diverse repertoire with an embodiment of spectacular corporeal intellect was inspiring to witness. The women's departure from normativity required code switching and code mixing. In the repertoire, which set the company up for contextualizing what contemporary ballet could be, and the freedom that resides in the movement slippage. In her book, The Black Dancing Body, A Geography from Coon to Cool, Brenda Dixon Godshield speaks of the perceptions and collusions between people of African and Europeanist descent, and the cultural readings that have informed contemporary American dance making. Dixon Godshield guides us to reimagine our thinking on difference and connectivity. Quote, "These differences in aesthetic languages account for a good deal of the misunderstanding that exists to this day between people of African and European lineage. They point to deep structured differences in cultural and social mores. In the classical Europeanist view, the movement exists to produce the finished work. In the Africanist view, the work exists to produce the movement. As assessed by Africanist aesthetic criteria, the Europeanist dancing body is rigid, aloof, cool, and one-dimensional. By Europeanist standards, the Africanist dancing body is vulgar, comic, uncontrolled, undisciplined, and most of all, promiscuous. However, these differences are not so marked once we leave behind the traditional classical African and European forms and look at the production of contemporary dance. In the dances created in the United States and Europe by Blacks and whites during the 20th century, these aesthetic strains are no longer separate, but are, as Marlis Yearby points out, interconnected and mixed up just as much as blood is, end quote. DTH's uniqueness was about the mixing up. And in the 1990s, the company had a distinct environment where Black women shifted forms daily and their bodies grew accustomed to going on and off point in the context of a rehearsal period or performance. Much of the repertoire was geared to infuse African and European forms to expand the notions of what contemporary American ballet could inhabit. The repertoire required a specific open-minded dancer, and we were women that had studied around the world in premier ballet schools such as the Royal Ballet School, Pacific Northwest Ballet, San Francisco Ballet, Chicago City Ballet, Houston Ballet, Pennsylvania Ballet, and Boston Ballet. We were unsettled in those institutions and were searching for more. One reason we pursued careers at DTH was our desire for sisterhood and camaraderie with dancers that looked like us and understood the challenges of being Black, female, and technically proficient in ballet. In 1997, Vincent Manceau choreographed Sasanka on DTH, which was an Afrofusion work that combined virtuosic gestures and movements from South Africa, combined with traditional ballet and modern movements. The code mixing and code switching of dance forms in Sasanka was a continuation of the transgressive adaptability the women have possessed since the early 1970s. Manceau's contribution to DTH repertoire in the late 1990s was similar to Geoffrey Holder's in the 1970s with Douglas. Both ballets gave the dancer an outlet to perform works from an African diasporic perspective that were linked to American ballet and modern dance techniques. Speaking to the concept of corporeal adaptability within ballet, in 2011, I interviewed the current artistic director of DTH and former principal dancer, Virginia Johnson. She spoke of Black dancers who entered DTH in the 1990s and their ownership of the ballet form. Quote, "One of my favorite periods was, I must have been in my late 30s or maybe even 40s, when I started to see this generation of dancers come in, young dancers who were really beautiful and really accomplished and really at home with the idea that they were ballet dancers. It was a very different thing than I had experienced myself. I was like, wow, this is so beautiful. And this is because of Dance Theatre of Harlem. This is because of what we did. These people can walk in the room and say, of course, I am a ballet dancer," end quote. Johnson speaks of the dancers who entered the company at the end of the 20th century as having an automatic sense of personhood in ballet that can be directly attributed to training in white ballet schools. We were a product of the second generation of desegregation and benefited from ballet's new semi-open market training. In my early years of dancing with DTH, I realized the women in the company were shifting the foundation of white ballet citizenship. It is virtually impossible to watch the women of DTH perform and not question the overt and passive forms of whiteness ballet blatantly preserves as DTH questions and deconstructs. DTH shaped the culture for Black women performing ballet through promotional press materials, performances, and television appearances. The company's visual presence concretized the numerous possibilities Black women could identify with in classical, neoclassical, and contemporary ballet. DTH granted realistic professional goals for young Black girls who saw the company perform internationally and nationally, and affirmed the pursuit of a ballet career. The performances confirmed to Black dance connoisseurs and African-American parents that ballet was a career and could be possibly in a Black institution. Forming Black respectability through ballet. Before delving deeply into the women of DTH, a framing of the organization's inception is needed. In 1969, shortly after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Arthur Mitchell, a Harlem native and former principal dancer with New York City Ballet, along with acclaimed ballet teacher Carol Shook, founded the Dance Theatre of Harlem School. In the late 1960s, Harlem, New York was similar to many segregated American Black neighborhoods, which were the product of the Great Migration, racial segregation, race riots after Dr. King's assassination, and government-supported discriminatory housing policies that spatialized Black people. Spatializing African Americans was a confinement tactic of American urban planning that took place throughout the United States. When Mitchell opened the DTH school, there was division in perspective on the necessity for a ballet school in Harlem. Mitchell says, quote, "The rumors that went around, he's crazy, insane, nuts, Black kids could not relate. And even the Black community, they didn't know why I was coming up here to do ballet. In 2 months, I had 400 kids in the school. In 8 months, 800 kids in the school," end quote. With the success of the school by 1971, the professional dance company Dance Theatre of Harlem was formed. The company debuted in New York at the Guggenheim Museum with a group of young dancers who were destined to make an indelible mark on ballet's history. The performance at the Guggenheim was a provocative move for Mitchell and the dancers in a time when African Americans were still in a nationwide struggle to be perceived as human. The presentation of Black women performing ballet on the heels of the civil rights movement in an elite Europeanist art space disrupted the white ballerina movement. In 1971, the traditional idea of a Black woman's place as a caretaker remained largely unchanged. But these young women dancing at the Guggenheim were claiming their space as artists and challenging Black female American labor. The dancers in the first company formed radical new visions of how ballet could be viewed. Angela Wideman-Davis writes in Blues Legacies in Black Feminism, Gertrude Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and Billie Holiday, quote, "The overwhelming majority of Black working women cooked, cleaned house, did laundry, or engaged in some other form of domestic service for well-off white people," end quote. The Volya Glimp in Out of the House of Bondage, The Transformation of the Plantation Household, provides a vivid description of how white women saw Black female bodies as inherently in service to them. Quote, "No white woman of any standing nor hope, quote, no white woman of any standing nor who hoped to have any did her own housework," end quote. The hierarchical structure of labor between Black and white women dramatically influences the viewing and reading of Black female bodies performing ballet. For the women of DTH, the task of proving that Black women could dance as well as white female ballerinas was thrust into our laps, whether we liked it or not. Showing the value of the Black ballet dancer was an active task for Mitchell, which he enforced with each generation, particularly when ballets by George Balanchine were staged or rehearsed. We had to present ourselves in proper ballet rehearsal attire, which consisted of leotards and tights, maybe a skirt, and minimal warm-ups to be recipients of neoclassical ballet knowledge. Women found the rehearsal periods for Balanchine ballets emotionally heightened times because casting in the Balanchine ballets was a valued and coveted experience in the company. The pressure was intensified for DTH because the company was in the same city as New York City Ballet, putting an added level of critique on already marked bodies. The women were scrutinized, evaluated, and highly assessed by New York City Ballet's repetiteurs, Mitchell and DTH's ballet masters and mistresses for casting appropriateness. Performing the Balanchine ballets always had the pressure of informing New York City Ballet's repetiteurs and white audiences that Black dancers could execute neoclassical ballet. Ironically, we were cast in Balanchine ballets in which the original versions had white female bodies performing appropriated versions of Black women. The New York City Ballet, former ballerinas gained power and status in those ballets and were hired by DTH to teach and coach us on how to be jazzy with pointe shoes on. Our Black bodies were already infused with syncopation, polyrhythms, and virtuosic technique. Therefore, the coaching was often antagonistic and insulting. A celebrated Balanchine repetiteur would often say to the young dancers, "You're talented, but you're lazy." The statement was voiced if you didn't execute the movements in a manner she approved of. By the early to mid 1990s, most of the women at DTH in their 20s were highly influenced by contemporary culture, and that was mapped on our bodies and existence. It was impossible to harness that we were informed by the golden years of hip hop culture. While touring, it was common for us to play Biggie Smalls, Mary J. Blige, or Tevin Campbell in the Corps de Ballet dressing room to get hyped before performing Balanchine's The Four Temperaments. Proving technical skill wasn't the dominant agenda for many of the young dancers at the time, but proving equality was of extreme importance to Mitchell, even though we may have never harbored feelings of inequality or inferiority. We were from an era of being educated as children next to white dancers, therefore questioning our technical skill wasn't a concern. When Mitchell formed the identity of DTH, the company had to align with what America deemed a valid ballet company to secure funding, audiences, and touring. DTH placed itself in the presence of the ballet world by sharing many of the ballets American Ballet Theatre and New York City Ballet performed. As an audience member, you could come to a DTH performance and view acculturated versions of classical and neoclassical works that were done by the A-list white ballet companies in New York and throughout America. A small representation of the shared repertoire consisted of The Four Temperaments, Serenade, Allegro Brillante, Agon, Concerto Barocco, all choreographed by Balanchine, Fall River Legend by Agnes DeMille, Voluntaries by Glenn Tetley, Othello by John Butler, Fancy Free by Jerome Robbins, and Creole Giselle, a restaged rendition of the Rhineland-German Giselle, choreographed by Jean Corelli and Jules Perrault, and staged by Freddie Franklin. Ballet's most marketable commodity is the white woman as ballerina, and reviews of the company critiqued ballet women as in pursuit of white ballet values, but never attaining the standard. The sharing of repertoire opened the doors to comparisons, and considering ballet showcases the female gender, the women gained the greatest amount of written criticism from the media. In the New York Times, Anna Kisselkoff writes her critique of Creole Giselle, quote, "Stylistically, the dancing has certain points that are debatable. The perfect body placement necessary for classical lines is less important to the women than to the men in the company," end quote. Kisselkoff's assessment of the Black women performing Creole Giselle is an example of white women maintaining white social dominance in ballet by erasing the virtuosic labor the women performing Creole Giselle. She specifically makes a point of focusing on a binary opposition between the Black female body and the Black male body to place the women outside of the necessary classical technique lines of ballet. Under the context of white dominance, it is difficult for many who witness DTH to see Black women as creative and productive citizens in the ballet form. Johnson's position as artistic director of DTH has created a significant mark in the American ballet industry. But even in 2021, Black women are highly underrepresented as dancers, choreographers, artistic directors, and executive directors. Censorship of the legs and feet. One of the most radical acts of DTH was placing the female dancers in flesh-colored tights and pointe shoes. Various narratives exist about who came up with the idea. In my entire existence at DTH, I had always heard Arthur Mitchell say he had thought of it. But after leaving the company, I was informed that a former Ballet of the 20th Century dancer and early DTH school instructor, Diane Robinson, borrowed the concept from Maurice Béjart. The idea completely changed the visual culture of DTH. Flesh-colored tights and brown pointe shoes became a signature identity of the organization. You could purchase the tights and shoe dyeing material in the DTH building to suit your chosen color. If you take pink tights and pink pointe shoes away, the ballerina becomes an identity that any ethnic group can slip into as long as you become proficient in the technique. As ballet schools have integrated, we witness Black and white dancers training from the beginning together, and young dancers, regardless of race, start with possibilities because all bodies are different. Teaching courses in dance appreciation, I have come across texts such as Learning About Dance, Dance as an Art Form and Entertainment, that credits French dancer, choreographer, and teacher Charles-Louis Didelot with transforming costuming to flesh-colored tights for women and introducing pointe shoes. In his book, 50 Ballet Masters from the 16th to the 20th Century, Lincoln Kirstein writes, quote, Didelot is credited with an early use of flesh-colored tights called maillot. After their inventor, a hosier at the opera, tights soon replaced stockings, making a cleaner profile in movement, end quote. In the 19th century, the hosier at the opera was clothing European bodies and white skin. And white skin would have been the subject at hand that needed a cleaner profile. Pink was the color chosen to create a transparent look on white skin tones. By the 1980s, white women were given options of pink tight colors to better match their skin, such as theatrical pink, ballet pink, point pink, and light pink. The gesture of changing the color of tights and pointe shoes to coincide with Black female dancers' arms and faces becomes so distracting for those uninterested in institutional transformations that it becomes impossible to concentrate on the actual ballet. In an article titled Dance Theatre of Harlem in Conversation with Brenda Dixon Godshield, writer Ellen Gerdes interviewed Dixon Godshield addressing the women of DTH and the notion of performing in brown tights and pointe shoes. Ellen says, what did you think about the dancers wearing tights and pointe shoes to match their skin? I found myself distracted by wondering how exactly they measured or quantified skin color. Dr. Dixon Godshield, I find it so pedestrian, and I don't mean in a postmodern sense. Pink tights are a convention. Doing ballet in pink tights never meant that white women had legs the color of those tights. White women came in many shades, and no one ever assumed you had to have different colored tights for them. So why should this be the case for this company? And then, of course, it calls your attention not even to different colors of skin, but to the different colors of the tights. I think it was an overly self-conscious means of allowing Black ballerinas on the ballet stage. And I think we are beyond that now. There are pictures in Dance Magazine now of very brown-skinned girls dancing with pink tights on, and you don't blink an eye, just as you would not blink an eye if you saw a brown-skinned girl in the core of Giselle. Ellen Gerdes reveals her distraction to Dr. Dixon Godshield about being put in a situation where she witnessed women performing in tights and shoes that matched their skin color, which brought about a curiosity of how the color is quantified. I find it disturbing that Gerdes needed confirmation from a Black woman that brown tights are off-putting and unnecessary. The pink tight conversation often centers itself around white women's diminished control over ballet and their loss of status if other ethnicities find freedom and liberation in ways they have not. The women of DTH wearing brown tights and pointe shoes became an act of defiance that places the Black female body outside of the constructed white ballet costume that Didelot invented. It is a common practice for any wardrobe department to contend with differentiation in skin coloring and costuming whenever a natural effect is desired. The quantification is much like when one goes to a makeup store and picks out a foundation shade to best suit her or his skin color. Godshield's position is particularly distressing to me because, like many women in the company, I have felt the transformative power of putting on brown tights and pointe shoes for the first time and feeling at home and empowered. I interviewed former DTH principal dancer Caroline Roche, who insists when wearing brown tights, quote, "I felt my lines were elongated," end quote. She also helped me remember a time a repetiteur from the Balanchine Trust came to DTH to stage Serenade. When Serenade is done by white ballet companies at the end, the women take their hair out of their buns or French twists and perform the last section of the ballet with their hair down. We were asked by the repetiteur, "Why don't you guys let your hair down? Because it's part of the choreography." No one in the rehearsal room knew why, so we tried it. That rehearsal, we took our hair down and multiple hair textures were everywhere. It was radically beautiful, infused with blackness as we wore our brown tights and pointe shoes with untamed black hair. We never performed that aspect of the choreography again, and it was as if that moment had never happened. Serenade was set on DTH in 1979 and has never been performed with the hair down. In the context of performing classical and neoclassical ballet, brown tights and pointe shoes were a means of actualizing Black female identity in choreography that was meant to exclude our bodies. The first time I saw DTH at 11 years old, I was appreciative and proud of the many hues of brown legs on stage. Viewing the acknowledgement of the variances of Black women's skin, coloration was breathtaking. The company performed Firebird, choreographed by Jean Tyrus, and Stephanie Dabney was the Firebird. I said to my mother, "Why didn't someone think of brown tights and shoes earlier?" I look back at that experience, and I was viewing the women of DTH performing ballet without white policing of their legs and feet. The strike, altering existing arrangements of labor. By the mid to late 1990s, there were dancers in the company, female and male, who were interested in altering and improving working conditions and contractual provisions between DTH management and dancers. Ballet is an art form that is highly dependent on female labor, and many of the issues the dancers had were heavily felt by the women. Arthur Mitchell built the company on a system of hegemonic leadership and intimidation of the dancers. He often made a point of telling the company, "This is a benevolent dictatorship. If you don't like it, then you can leave." To have the women in the company mobilize with the men was a loss of power that was unexpected and devastating to Mitchell. He publicly and internally bestowed upon himself the father figure role that infantilized and silenced the dancers to an extent that most were completely terrified of him. The dancers standing up against Mitchell and management in a labor dispute shifted his perception of reality. In the winter of 1997, DTH presented a one-year collective bargaining agreement contract to the dancers with numerous givebacks and problematic revisions. At the time, the company was functioning under the American Guild of Musical Artists, AGMA union, violation of a maximum number of apprentices the company had the right to hire. The contract called for a maximum of 6, and the company had 8. The January 1997 issue of AGMazine published, quote, "This matter was brought to management's attention several weeks ago, and they have not yet corrected the situation," end quote. In the new contract presented by DTH management, a category called floaters was created, which were dancers categorically beneath apprentices that would not be a part of the AGMA bargaining unit. This issue was one of the major points the press wrote about because cheap female labor is how many ballet companies are able to perform big ballets. The companies utilize female labor from the ballet schools and second companies to fulfill the needs of large corps de ballet requirements. In order for DTH to perform ballets such as Creole Giselle, hiring student labor was the only way. Mitchell frequently casted probationary apprentices and apprentices in principal roles under the auspices of giving the dancers a chance. The female apprentices were cast with male corps de ballet demi-soloist and soloist company members, but couldn't reap the benefits of a full company contract. The women wanted to dance and were told they wouldn't be able to dance anywhere else. The abuse of apprentice labor was practiced for years and never contested until 1997. After numerous uncomfortable conversations with management and AGMA, on January 21st, 1997, 35 dancers walked off the job. We were the first unionized dancers in US history to strike. On February 7th, 1997, Mitchell scheduled an audition for dancers in hopes of replacing us all. On the day of the audition, we met at a principal dancer's home and strategized about how to picket the audition. The apprentices and corps de ballet members left the home of the principal dancer and walked to the building on 152nd Street in Harlem, charged and scared to death. When we got to the building, AGMA had set up signs on blue New York City police barricades that said, AGMA, on strike against Dance Theatre of Harlem. Members of the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations were on site waiting for us. We strung the signs we made around our neck, carried signs, and yelled at dancers as they got out of taxi cabs and entered the building to take our jobs. The predominant population of women who showed up for the audition to take our jobs were white and Asian. They were unemployed dancers that we recognized from taking open dance classes around New York City. The competition and scarcity of dance jobs in New York City during the late 1990s was so intense that dancers came uptown to audition for the company they would have never previously thought of dancing with. The picket line performance lasted for about an hour and a half until those of us behind the police barricades on the picket line and the AGMA representatives saw Mitchell walking towards the building with all of the soloists and principal dancers behind him, getting ready to go into the building. Somehow, the company had been divided, and Mitchell passed us on the picket line and said, "The family is back together." The AGMA representative stepped in and had a very ugly verbal altercation with Mitchell, stating all of the violations he would incur if he went into the building without the entire company. He decided to cancel the auditions, and we scheduled a meeting to negotiate and try to end the walkout. The dancers finally came to a settlement with management on February 9th, 1997. In the April 1997 edition of Dance Magazine, there is a photo taken by Caitlin Sims of 8 women on the picket line, and I have a sign around my neck with a particularly disgusted look on my face. Standing on the picket line, speaking up for improving employment relationships was one of the proudest moments of my career at DTH because I watched my factory working grandmother picket in Chicago. Body politics, hair, tattoos, and colorism. From the beginning, DTH women have performed radical transformations of what ballet can embody. Renegade images and posters of Virginia Johnson dancing with the most amazing afro in the 1970s set the tone for the women of the company to challenge conventional aesthetics. Fast forward to 2018, and the promotional image for the Dance Theatre of Harlem 2018 Vision Gala, which is commemorating the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., had Ingrid Silva featured in a yellow contemporary tutu, brown pointe shoes, no tights, and a stylish manicured afro. In Black and white communities, afros have been associated with a radical political stance, militancy, and also deemed to be an unprofessional hairstyle. In the early 1990s, dancer Karen Brown performed ballets such as Glenn Tetley's Dialogues with a high top fade, a hairstyle traditionally in the African-American community associated with men. The hairstyle references the Mangbetu tribe of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and ancient Egypt's Queen Nefertiti and her crown. The women of DTH performed subtle acts of resistance to white dominant ballet culture by wearing natural hairstyles to highlight Black female pride and agency. There is a lasting legacy of pride and protest among DTH women that is performed through hairstyling that ignores white normative attractiveness. Hair is such an important aspect of the Black community. It was only natural that a creative expression of hairstyling would find a place on the performance stage and in the images of DTH women. By the 1990s and early 2000s, women in the company were performing ballet roles tatted up in works choreographed by DTH, such as Signs and Wonders, choreographed by Alonzo King, Adrian Angel on Earth by John Elaine, and Twist by Dwight Roden, all choreographers that are recognized in the field of contemporary ballet. A Black female dancer in a ballet studio with tattoos has the potential to read to a contemporary ballet choreographer. Those dancers are acknowledging a current reality that is worth investigating. As tattoos are permanent, the markings were on our legs, hips, backs, and arms as we performed classical and neoclassical repertoire, but most viewers probably missed them. As an audience member, if you are able to release archetypal ballerina descriptors, one can watch and appreciate the women of DTH perform ballet with historic and present day Black, American, and American social references mapped on the bodies. DTH in its totality references and revises European ballet culture to eliminate a semblance of the exclusionary practices. Mitchell had an understanding of society's Black-white binary placement of difference on Black dancers. He shifted the power relations about knowledge and the Black body performing ballet by providing visibility through performance. The women were only able to be radically contemporary because there was a platform for them to dance. As Mitchell built a non-white dominant space and place for ballet, he created an environment where radical Black female dancers could emerge. Former New York City Ballet and DTH principal dancer Andrea Long speaks about dancing with the company. Quote, "I was getting closer to my own Blackness from being in a white ballet company for so long. It helped me find out who I was. DTH was our Mecca. I was at home with my people," end quote. As women dancing with DTH, we didn't have to compare ourselves daily to white ballerinas, and we didn't have to contend with preconceived negative stereotypes and biases against Black women from white women or white dancers and white artistic directors. DTH was a Black space with its own set of racial dynamics. In the company, the women dealt with the symptomatic legacy of white racism on Black bodies in the form of intra-racial discriminatory practices that Mitchell utilized in casting the female population. Privileging light-skinned women over dark was a gender-based decision that allowed men the advantage of performing any role regardless of skin color stratification. DTH was a microcosm of internal Black American struggles with race and colorism that are products of being from an enslaved population. Mitchell provided a place for Black women to dance, but the company had a skin tone hierarchy that directly related to the roles women danced. If the dancers were perceptive and stayed around long enough, it was obvious there was not an equal probability of being selected for roles because principal and soloist roles for women had skin color biases. Colorism in casting could be proven by looking at the lineage of women who danced the roles before you. An example of this form of typecasting would be the ballet Medea, choreographed by Michael Smuin. The Medea character was often cast with a dark-skinned dancer, and the princess was a light-skinned dancer. Mitchell's casting decisions socially constructed the importance of skin color for the women in the company and determined that light-skinned women would embody light, ethereal, and delicate roles, and dark-skinned women would embody aggressive, grounded, and highly physical roles. The dysfunctional relationship to skin color that Mitchell exercised when directing DTH relates to commonly held desires to replicate oppressive white norms that have been placed on Black bodies for centuries. The Black ballerinas who had features that resembled Caucasians had status within the company. As a woman, to carve out an identity and personality under Mitchell's conditions of color biasing was a scream for self-control within DTH's oppressive environment. Inserting elements of self in one's performative experience redefined femininity and attractiveness within the concert ballet world. The act of redefining femininity and attractiveness is what many young Black dancers identify with when DTH tours the country to perform, teach masterclasses, and execute lecture demonstrations as a part of residency activities. Conclusion. The women of DTH opened up market potential in the professional ballet world as Black female bodies were seen performing on tour worldwide. We were never able to perform or be reviewed without the burden of racial hierarchies, placing white ballerinas in a greater position of power and status over Black ballerinas. Yet the weight of years of hierarchical mediation couldn't overwhelm us because there was work to be done. Writing this chapter, I had to analyze how the women of DTH fit within the genre of contemporary ballet. DTH was a very particular environment that was unlike any other ballet company in America and was contemporary before its time. Arthur Mitchell's company provided opportunities for Black women that couldn't have existed without DTH. Mitchell's own career is a testament that the struggle for ballet jobs and inclusivity was not as pressing of an issue for men as it was for women. Mitchell achieved principal status with New York City Ballet in 1956, at the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. In 1956, Black ballerinas existed in the underground dance market, but for the general public, they were unheard of. I am extremely proud of the work that I did at DTH, and it instilled a perseverance in me to continue a dance career after leaving the company. The radical Black female bodies of DTH didn't cease their work when they left the stage and studio. Just the opposite. It continues through educating the next generation of young aspiring Black ballet dancers by teaching in local and professional schools and universities across the country, lecturing, choreographing, art making, and experiential writing from dancers who now have a voice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Thank you. I feel like I want to, we can all do our applause here. If I can get the emoji up here. I don't think we can. Oh, here are the comments coming through. That was wonderful. That was fantastic. Thank you so very much. Let's see here. I would like to just pause for a second and thank you for giving your presentation today that's part of AFAM's Faculty Conversation Series, that's part of African Studies 50th Anniversary Celebration. And thanks to everyone for being here today. Let's see, if you have a question or comment, please go ahead and type your question or comment in the comment box or the Q&A box. There are a lot of messages coming through right now, Tanya. I don't know if you can see them. Thank you, you know, it was amazing. There are a lot of comments here. Maybe we can go ahead and get started with some questions. As someone with two daughters who danced early on too with ballet, you know, doing ballet, I was thinking about that. I mean, I remember the pointe shoes, I remember the tights, I remember everything you were saying. I just appreciate it so much. And then as a cultural anthropologist, I, you know, with this whole, you know, autoethnographic approach, I appreciated that too. You know, entering in, you know, with your story, your experience early on with the Nutcracker and thinking about that and what you heard and what you experienced. And then, you know, having these questions and incorporating more stories, just part of that. That is just amazing. I did have a question coming back, thinking about the Nutcracker and thinking about the diversity that we see now, you know, around, you know, the country. And I saw somewhere recently that I think it's in Philadelphia, they're going to have an all black Nutcracker, in part, saying to make dance more, accessible. So, that conversation is out there.
Yeah.
But I wanted to see if we could talk a little bit more. There's some things I've made note of here, of the code switching again, and what you experienced and where we are today. And also with colorism, when you were speaking, I thought about Misty Copeland. I mean, we see Misty Copeland, I just kept thinking about her, and that's probably because she has been out there so much, and we see her image, and we've heard her story. And I think a lot of times we think that we've moved on, but it's so much a part of a lot of our experiences and a lot of our spaces. So it was interesting to hear you, in a very difficult, kind of reminder of where we are, but again, at the same time, that pushback, and then, moving through with, like you were saying, what we're seeing now with dance. So I don't know, that wasn't really a question. It was more of a comment, just listening to you and just reflecting and thinking about your own personal experience, and, and now with your projects and things, and how you're moving things forward.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, when we think about Misty, I mean, I know Misty, we were in the same circle. She was at ABT while I was at Dance Theatre of Harlem and at Lines in San Francisco. And when Misty started, getting her whole mediated identity, I think there were a lot of women of DTH who were like, wait a minute, this work has been going on since 1968. Like, it didn't start with her. And, we support her with her trajectory of having a voice in terms of, at this particular moment, she pretty much is the voice for Black ballet. But there was a lot of work that happened before her, before me, before I mean, there are just so many other women who, were fighting a battle, who were taking dance lessons outside of the studio because they couldn't go inside of the studio. They were in the hallways taking ballet classes because they weren't allowed inside of the studio.
Exactly. There's a comment here. Let me see here. Let me just read. Okay, so there have been full cast dancers, yes, of color of the Nutcracker production since 1970s. Yes, exactly. I remember seeing that too, growing up, in Northwest Indiana. Yeah, exactly. And then,
sorry, go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say, I think that the Nutcracker itself even has a rough history. I mean, we look at the Nutcracker, and the whole second act is about appropriating ethnic identities. And so we take this very problematic ballet in the context of whiteness, and these white bodies going and performing Russian, Chinese, all of these identities, Spanish and Arabian, and, whiteness gets the privilege of being able to perform any ethnic identity and not get contested. And then we take that same production and feel like it's okay to put it on Black bodies. And so I think there's another lens that maybe we could look at Nutcracker in that it actually just may be problematic.
Okay, definitely. Okay, let's come back around to that. I want to hear more about that. There are a couple of questions here, going back to Misty, or a couple of comments. So I'm thinking about what we're saying about, or what you were saying about Misty. Absolutely, especially as Misty talks about transforming her body. And then there's another comment saying that she just published her new book, paying homage to those who paved the way for Black dancers of today. So I was wondering that too. I was thinking about that. It seems like at some point, in your career or anyone's career, they would think back and say, okay, let's pay tribute to this person. Think about those who paved the way for us to be able to be where we are right now, like a Sankofa moment. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah. And also Dance Theatre of Harlem has a new coffee table book that just came out, I think this month.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, and Thaddeus and I are in it. The work that we choreographed on the company is in it.
Okay. Awesome. Let me see here if there are any questions in the Q&A box. I think we've covered the chat questions so far. Tanya, could you talk about, thinking about your some of your recent projects too, as we wait for more questions and comments?
Mhm.
Thinking about migratude's ataraxia, thinking about the stories that you're telling now. I think again, based on history, based thinking about the voices and experiences, with this new, well, not just this generation, but just telling right now for everyone, making it accessible, using the space in a different way, and just kind of telling these stories. Can you talk about that some?
Yeah, I mean, I think dancing with Dance Theatre of Harlem gave me a wonderful education on how to tell stories. We did
Exactly.
so many works by so many of these choreographers that were considered great choreographers for the concert dance stage. And it just really gave me an education of how to look at the craft of storytelling in a concert dance form, which also allows me to be able to have that model, but be able to do something different from that model and take dance outside of the proscenium into site specific
Mm-hmm.
environments. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Thaddeus and I, we just got so much education there. I mean, we were touring probably for 20 weeks out of a year, maybe 30 weeks out of a year every year. So we were
Mm-hmm.
living in New York, but we were dancing around the world.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to see other cultures, and I mean, I have this amazing memory of performing at the Parthenon in Greece, Athens,
Oh,
Greece,
wow. Wow.
Serenade, George
Mm-hmm.
Balanchine's Serenade, and just feeling the breeze as you're standing there on stage in the Parthenon. I mean,
Right.
just these really like amazing experiences that,
Mm-hmm.
you only have once in a
That's
lifetime.
right. That's right. That's right. I would love to see pictures of that. Okay.
Yeah.
There's another comment and then a question in the chat. Let's see. So much of what happens in the performing arts is generated by current events and the needs of a local and national media. That's one comment there. And then the question, Thaddeus has a question. Can you speak about the relevance of the form today and why it is still part of your practice?
Yeah, it's still part of my practice because, for one thing, I'm still dancing. But I think that the
Mm-hmm.
relevance for me with ballet is it has to change and it has to be able to live in the time period that it's in. We cannot look at it as only this historic form and then take
Right.
all of those historic modalities and situate it on these now and contemporary bodies, because when dancers are coming into the studio, they already are listening to Nicki Minaj, they're listening to Megan the Stallion. They
Right.
have African aesthetics mapped on their bodies already because they're listening to the music. So
Mm-hmm.
situate something from, these very codified ballet schools and the five ballet schools and forms, it has to morph, it has to change, just simply because
Mm-hmm.
we're working in a different time, we're living in a different time, and we're so inundated with technology.
Exactly. Exactly. So true. So true. Oh, here's a question. Thank you so much. Let's see here. Okay, here's a question.
Mhm.
Um, to change ballet to fit current cultural needs of contemporary bodies, is it important to retool old stories or create new works?
Absolutely. We cannot have dance or ballet be a museum form. It
Mhm.
has to continue to change. And every other art form seems to be able to do it.
Mm,
Ballet doesn't. We're wanting to stick to this old mode and this very antiquated way of being in it. But
mm,
audiences are diminishing
wow.
because we have not found a way to move forward with the form. It's really difficult to get people to come to a theater and to sit in a dark room next to other people you don't know, to look at something that's very far away and not have any historic connection to it.
Hmm.
It's difficult for people to come to a theater. It's difficult to think that the form can actually compete with this, this device, because everything is
Hmm.
at our hands right now. So
Hmm.
how are we going to make dance more accessible? How are we going to infuse it with some of these contemporary ways that we're living in life right now?
Exactly, exactly. There's a comment here. Moving forward, it is important that the African American community create its halls of greatness, where dancers of color can have the freedom to work and perform. So I'm thinking about, different places around the country. Kind of, what are you seeing right now, Tanya, with, creating those spaces in these areas? Again, just with this in mind, celebrating, again, thinking about people who've come before and kind of moving forward, and changing things, like you said, that kind of constant kind of renovation, or so to speak.
Yeah, I think the question is the funding that comes to African American dance artists has to be as accessible as it is for white artists. And if we don't have the funding and the platform to actually have creative and imaginative spaces, then these places are not going to happen. The work is not going to be able to be seen, just simply because it's expensive to make the work.
Yeah.
It's expensive to make any artwork, but particularly when you're dealing with bodies, the bodies have to be paid. The bodies have to have a sense of safety wherever they're performing. So I think that there is an investment maybe that we can start to look at and not use the canon of Europeanist aesthetics as our model, and go back to the community.
Go back to the community. Excellent. Excellent point. Exactly. Love that. Love that. Nancy Tolson had a point in the chat earlier too. She said she loves the stories and she can't wait to see the book. So I guess I would just say, kind of where, just to maybe as we kind of wrap up right now with our time, kind of where you are, kind of next steps, what you're working on, that kind of thing.
Yes. So we have several different things. We have a film that we premiered last month for the Southern Foodways Alliance that is a documentary on dance, foodways, and my family migration, and Thaddeus's family migration. And that will be screened at the Alabama Dance Festival in January.
Oh, wow. Awesome.
And then also we will be performing Migratus within the next year. We're working on dates again. So during COVID, our tour was halted because of COVID. And so now we're rebooking those dates. Yeah, there's a lot going on. We're writing another chapter for the Oxford Handbook of Black Studies. So yeah.
Awesome. That is so awesome. Congratulations on everything. Congratulations. We should actually screen. I would love to screen the film too.
Yes.
That's great. Okay, I know we are all here at the 1 o'clock hour and wrapping up here, but we really appreciate your time today. And this is fantastic, wonderful work. And we're excited about the work you're doing. So, and positive vibes moving forward. Thanks everyone for coming today. And we look forward to seeing you at more of our events during this year. So take care, everyone, and have a great rest of the day and weekend. Okay, and thanks again.
Bye.
Tanya, this was wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Let's see.